Good evening and welcome to my channel. A little bit of a beer. Beer and beard. I'm letting myself go, basically. Anyway, I have another story for you. Trying to do them a little bit more frequently than I have of late. This is story number 104, believe it or not. And as usual, it's based on 5 random words. And the words for this story are... And the story is number 104, and it's called The Three Sisters. Hannah had a quandary, and a painfully pressing one at that. She was 38 years old, and the fertility specialist had just informed her that her likelihood of conceiving a child was vanishingly slim and dwindling with every passing year. To make matters worse, she just discovered that the main reason her husband of 9 years was no longer sleeping with her was not due to his diminished libido following a rugby injury, but rather that he'd been having an affair with a much younger work colleague. Mark didn't know that Hannah was aware of the affair, which had been going on for over 2 years now. Not yet, at any case. She'd had her suspicions for a while, and had confirmed them by following Mark to one of his squash games, to discover that the only games Mark was playing was with his marriage. Hannah, a lapsed Catholic, had assumed that this sort of textbook infidelity was beyond a man as prosaically bland as her quantity surveyor husband, whom she'd married largely for his reliability. How naive she'd been. Now she realised that the continuously delayed baby she'd been asking for would probably never come, not unless she did something desperate. A long, boozy lunch with her purple-haired school friend Natalie later, Hannah had devised a plan, one that anyone else she told, other than Natalie, would have deemed crazy. Of course, she didn't want to stay with Mark any longer than necessary. She simply needed his seed. She'd considered the various means of extracting his genetic essence, but the procedure was too challenging, and knowing her luck, Hannah would probably kill him in the process. Murder wasn't quite on her mind. There had to be another way. Blackmail was a possibility, persuading him to impregnate her in exchange for her silence regarding the affair. Embarrassing Mark with his family wouldn't work. They were fairly incorrigible atheists from Edinburgh, investment brokers, ad executives and the like. But his colleagues, perhaps? Hannah had quickly discounted the idea. Mark was a vindictive type, and she didn't fancy the notion of having sex with someone who despised or feared her. Plus, she had the notion that any child conceived in resentment would never turn out well. No, Mark had to think he was fulfilling his conjugal duty. Ideally, he'd get her with child, and then she could divorce him at her leisure. "It's going to sound nuts," Natalie said, as Hannah was exploring her options out aloud in the Peebles tea shop they frequented. "But I know a spell that might work, and a place to cast it." Natalie, as well as owning the village's spiritual supplies shop, full of rose quartz crystals and dream catchers, was a practicing Wiccan white witch. Hannah seldom delved deep into this inscrutable and frankly laughable aspect of her friend's life, but she was desperate now and willing to give credence to anything. She'd almost certainly regret what she said next, but then needs must when you have an achingly empty nest. "Go on then, spill." On Sunday morning, instead of going to her usual yoga class, Hannah drove out along country lanes to a quiet car park by an old stone bridge and stood gazing into the River Tweed, reciting Natalie's spell over and over in her head. It wouldn't do to say the words aloud, not yet. When she was ready, she forced the woolly hat down over her ears and put on the walking boots she'd stashed under the passenger seat footwell. On the seat beside her was her kit bag containing the rolled-up yoga mat, a towel and a change of clothes she'd never use. She gulped down some water from her plastic bottle. It wouldn't do for it still to be full, although this granted her husband a degree of acuity she was sure he lacked. Hannah locked the car, crossed the bridge, walked a little way up the road and found the narrow footpath under coppery beech trees which led uphill towards the Three Brethren. "I don't think of them as brothers," Natalie had explained. "To me, they're clearly sisters. I mean, they're bloody egg-shaped after all." On top of the hill sat 3 8-foot-high cairns, constructed from crudely cut granite slabs somewhere around the 16th century, and renovated across the intervening centuries. Nobody knew entirely what they meant, but a metal plaque positioned nearby offered the speculation that they marked the perimeter of lands once belonging to the lairds of Yare. Liars of Yare, more like, Natalie had opined. They're a witch's meeting place, more like. Clearly a perfect place to cast spells. Hannah hadn't known how serious her friend was, but if her ridiculous plan was to have any efficacy, then she had to take her spellcasting seriously. Location was paramount, and these ovoid monuments, atop a wind and rain-scoured hilltop, were perfect. As Hannah picked her way up the rocky slopes leading to the top of the hill named after the brethren, she began to regret not mixing in a little cardio with her yoga. She was quickly breathless, with 200 feet still to climb. How come she'd never taken this walk before? Mark and Hannah had lived in Peebles for almost 5 years. She paused her ascent to catch her breath and look around. The sky was overcast, full of glowering rain clouds. Drizzly mist obscured much of the valley. This was a shame. The southern upland way ought to provide a spectacular view on a clear day. Perhaps this dreek murk was more appropriate, however, given what she had in mind. 20 minutes later, pushing her hands down on her thighs for added momentum, Hannah felt the rocky ground begin to level below her. The scrubby forest to her right fell away as the rounded top of the hill presented itself. Wind and slanting rain were now blasting the left side of her face into numbness. Stray red hairs fluttered out from under her hat to stick to her icy cheek, almost as if trying to hide the Malta-shaped ruddy red birthmark she had there, a blemish that Mark had once jokingly called her witch's mark. He'd never have guessed that his teasing joke would one day become prophecy. At first it looked like there was only one cairn marking the hilltop. Then, as Hannah climbed the last few feet, 2 more hove into view. Fortunately, nobody was about, and why on earth would they be a little after 8 a.m. on a viciously inclement September morning? The elements were whipping the stones and Hannah with violent turbulence. Veils of mist and lashing rain stung her reddening cheeks. Hannah walked into the centre of the stones. There were 3 verses in the short rhyme she'd learned. Each must be directed towards a unique stone, a different sister. Perhaps the stones were androgynous, gender fluid in modern parlance. She stretched out a hand and touched the first stone. It felt surprisingly warm, but perhaps that's just because her fingers were icy. Withdrawing her hand, she took out the craft knife she'd concealed in her jeans pocket, uncapping its lid. Could she really do this? Taking a deep breath, Hannah drew the blade sharply across the palm of her left hand. The knife cut deeper than she'd expected, blood instantly welling to the wound. "Fucking hell," she said, forgetting herself and pressing her hand against her jeans. It left a bloody smear. Shit, Hannah thought. I'll have to change into my yoga leggings later. She looked at her hand. The wound was an inch long and bleeding profusely. Not so deep that a plaster couldn't cover it, however. Not deep enough to need stitches. She had tissues in her other pocket, but for now she needed the blood to keep flowing. Leaning towards the cold stone, Hannah pressed her hand firmly against the granite. "Stones of the earth, stones of the sky, bring me a wee bairn by and by." The spell, adapted by Natalie, was nothing if not literal. Hannah spun on her heels and walked over to the second stone. Her hand throbbed. The wind blew at her back now, almost knocking her off her feet. The stone felt a little colder, since it bore the full brunt of the tumultuous weather. "Take from my hand the pulse of my blood. Take from my breath, and let it do good." She exhaled deeply, exactly as she'd been told to, a cloud of breath blowing out over the surface of the stone. Was it really that cold up here? She moved to the third stone, noting with satisfaction the red stain her wound had left on the second. "Take from these words, and take from this art, a life for a life, and a new beating heart." Hannah swallowed fearfully, hearing herself complete the incantation. Some fragment of her Catholic upbringing quailed at the blasphemy of it. The third stone anointed, Hannah closed her eyes and counted to 10, arms outstretched, rotating slowly and trying not to fall over. When she was at the end of her count, she heard a voice. "Oh, sorry, are we interrupting?" She opened her eyes. 2 hill walkers, a father and son. Hannah would have blushed if her cheeks weren't already ruddy red. She closed her left hand to hide the wound, hoped the hikers hadn't seen the dark stains on the stones. Not at all. I'm just being daft," she explained with forced levity. "No harm in that," smiled the father. "No harm at all." Back at home, it seemed Hannah would get away with her subterfuge. Mark was out, having gone for a run. She knew this because his trail shoes were missing from the back door. Hannah scrubbed her jeans in the kitchen sink, getting most of the blood out, then threw them in the washing machine with half a load of other clothes. She washed her wound and put a big plaster on it. She'd say she cut it on a tin of fruit cocktail, her usual post-yoga treat. Mark returned 20 minutes later, all sweaty and red-faced from his run. Not lying about his whereabouts for once, she thought. Then, remarkably, perhaps because she'd changed into the provocatively low V-neck red sweater and short denim skirt she knew he liked, and maybe also because he was flushed with post-run hormones, Mark grabbed her and pulled her into the shower with him. They hadn't had sex in the bathroom for almost a year, Hannah reckoned. Mark was rough but enthusiastic, and Hannah was happy to oblige. If this was the spell working its magic, so be it. Later, while Mark watched his snooker semi-final in the spare room, Hannah called Natalie and told her everything. When she'd finished, Hannah was expecting an excited congratulations from her friend. Instead, Natalie said, following a moment's silence, "There's something I didn't tell you. If I had, you'd not have gone through with it." 2 days later, Natalie phoned in sick to her job as an administrator for a leukemia charity. Mark had already left for work, late as usual, speeding off in a shower of gravel in the Audi. She had the whole day to herself. Time to work up towards the terrible thing she had to do. It was obvious in retrospect. It was there in the words of the incantation, a life for a life. She took Tabitha, their tortoise-shell tabby, out into the garden shed, with the sharpest kitchen knife under her arm. Tabitha was placid, evidently having no sixth sense for her own imminent demise. Her eyes held the same comic disdain as ever, her slightly chubby body betraying no raised heartbeat as Hannah closed the door behind her and placed her pet on the dusty boards. Hannah sat on an upturned mop bucket and opened the can of tuna she'd brought, tossing a few chunks onto the floor with the point of the knife. How could she do this? Hannah felt tears welling in her eyes at the very thought of it. She'd surely go straight to hell if such a place turned out to exist. A poor innocent animal, albeit one with a tendency to scratch strangers. Tabitha was crouching to gobble down the delicious fish in brine. Hannah could just grab her and plunge the knife into her back. It would be over in moments. She felt her heart beating wildly as she moved her knife grip from an underhand to an overhand position, a stabbing stance. Bzzz! Hannah jumped as the phone in her back pocket vibrated loudly. She wouldn't answer. A call now would definitely derail her frankly evil scheme. Who was she kidding? She wasn't going to kill the cat. Hannah was the kind of person who painstakingly caught blue bottles under pint glasses and shepherded them outside to buzz another day. She couldn't possibly murder a poor defenceless animal, and certainly not a beloved pet. In that moment, Hannah felt a peculiar and unique cocktail of shame, relief, and disappointment. She instinctively knew that even if she could locate the hedgehog who lived under the holly bush, she'd not be able to kill it either. Hannah also suspected a worm or spider would not tip the balance of Wiccan power in her favour, not an equivalent sacrifice. Hannah tipped the rest of the tuna onto the floor and silently apologised to the blithely voracious tabby cat as the animal gulped it down. Hannah didn't return any of the calls that came through from Natalie, her mother-in-law, or from the unknown number that kept trying. Instead, she opened a bottle of Pinot Grigio and proceeded to get drunk. It was only when she heard the stout rap on her front door and looked at her phone to find she'd missed 17 calls that Hannah realised something was seriously wrong. There were 2 young police persons at the door, 1 male, 1 female. The woman officer spoke. "Mrs. Hannah McMillan? Is your husband named Mark?" Hannah nodded mutely, feeling her heartbeat accelerating wildly for the second time that day. She leaned against the door jamb, at first because she wanted to appear more sober than she was, but also because she knew what was coming. "I'm afraid We have some bad news. There's been an accident. A freak accident, as it happened. On his way to work, blasting along the quiet border roads, Mark had evidently swerved to avoid something, possibly a roe deer, common around these parts. The Audi had collided with a digger which had chosen that moment to reverse out of a field. Mark had been projected through the windscreen into the digger's bucket. He'd not worn his seatbelt and had almost certainly died in an instant, his skull shattered. The airbag had failed to fire, which the manufacturer swore was all but impossible. There were no skid marks on the road because Mark hadn't been able to brake. Somehow a plastic drinking bottle had rolled under the middle pedal, meaning that when he tried to jam on the brakes, presumably, nothing had happened. Even had he braked, there was only a slim chance he'd have survived, the coroner explained at Mark's inquest, as if that held any consolation. The drink bottle was Hannah's. She'd brought it with her to cement her yoga-based alibi on the day of her spellcasting. The bottle had always annoyed her by being just a little too wide to fit into the Audi's cup holders. 3 weeks later, following the inquest, the cremation, and the memorial, once she'd finished weeping and an endurable numbness had replaced the constant guilt and terror she'd experienced after Mark's death, Hannah began to feel unaccountably nauseous each morning. She visited her local pharmacy with a strange sensation of sad excitement fluttering in her chest, an anxiety of hope and fear. Back at home, sitting on the toilet, staring at two faint but undeniable little lines, Hannah immediately knew one thing with certainty. She'd have to be exceptionally careful not to piss off her friend Natalie from now on. And that's that. As some of you may know, that story is based on a real place, 3 cairns on top of a hill, not too far from Galashiels, called the Three Brethren, and it is a very spooky place indeed. So it sort of inspired me to write something of a ghastly nature. Anyway, hope you enjoyed that, and if you did, you can share it on social media, like it, subscribe, do all those wonderful things, and I'll see you again very soon. Bye.